So how does the exam differ from your real life experience as an architect?
Well, I mean, the exam, I mean, first off, residential is just going to be different than a lot of these. The 5.0 is targeted on larger projects.
Hmm.
And so, ADA doesn't really come in the same way. And so there's a lot of things that I just was interested in, the differences between what I was doing, in residential work in San Francisco versus what, what much larger firms might be thinking about.
Hmm.
But it was helpful because I think whatever your real life experience is, I think architects a lot of times they're going to work for, one firm or maybe shift firms every couple of years or whatever. But the culture inside that firm and what kind of project types they specialize, you kind of just get in these little niches where you don't have a lot of communication or a lot of exposure to maybe what other sectors of the industry are doing. So even if it's not, what you're learning on the exam is not your firm experience, I still think it was useful, it was interesting, and it sort of broadens your perspective on how to think about these things at any level. So I think a lot of when I hear people talk about like, oh, that's not what I do, and that's not how our contracts are written, or this is not, I think that we do this better than what NCARB asked, or yeah, I've heard all these sorts of pieces of feedback from people. I'm like, well, I don't think that is really the point. I think the point is, taking more of a broad stance on how NCARB wants you to think about that, and I think that it'll apply to whatever you're doing. Or maybe at least give you a counterpoint, be like, well, there's a reason that I think this works a little bit better in this firm than, how I would answer the question in NCARB format. And in the video lectures, Mike Newman was talking about that as well. There are certain points where, like, in my practice, and we kind of do it this way, and it veers off a little bit. And I think that's a normal experience.
Hmm.
And so I think it gets people out of like their own particular firm and project type and broadens the way you're thinking about it a little bit.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think if you try to put yourself in the shoes of NCARB, they're supposed to be coming up with a test that somehow evaluates, all these architects in the country. Every state's a little bit different. Every firm's a little bit different. Geez, how do they come up with some way to assess all these people in all these different situations? And I think when it comes down to it, they have to make some calls, and they have to say, well, we're going to focus on this type of building type, and we're going to use these contracts, and they have to sort of kind of put a stake in the ground and say, this is what we're going to focus on. And it's important that everyone who's taken this test, I think, sort of knows, like, okay, well, I might not be working on those building types, but this exam is focused on that, or I might not be using those contracts, but this exam is focused on that, and that's okay. And forget about what you already think about that building type or those exam or those contracts. Um, they're just the ones I got to deal with for this, exam. So I'm just going to deal with them for now. Michael, I wonder what your thoughts are here about how the difference between the exam versus the real life practice as an architect.
Yeah, I thought my process of studying was really complementary. Like it was great to learn about. Uh, so my project has a really complicated contract.
Hmm.
But it's great to learn about how maybe a typical contract works and the different relationships between the entities and how the procedure is supposed to go. So I thought that studying really helped with um, just laying out what, um, even if your firm doesn't totally do it like this, I think the studying process helped me realize like, oh, well, maybe this is how it should be done. And it's not just been a tradition that's passed down, but they're teaching us to do it like this to protect us from a certain liability, um, you know, financial or, taking things on that we aren't responsible for. And that was really helpful. And another part was the complementary the other way, where there was a lot of practices in the firm and working on this project that really showed up in the exams. Like, oh, this is how you quickly run through a crazy amount of information, identify, one tag here that leads you here to lead you to an asterisk here to read something in the code or look something up in the spec, and just, quickly find this piece of information, extract it, and then figure out how to implement it. And that's a lot of what I do in my regular job, and then it
Hmm.
sort of came easy on the test.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's great. Tyler, tell me a little bit about your feelings here.
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously, I think a lot of people, when they talk about real life versus the exams, they're talking about the contracts, which is something that from firm to firm, everybody's going to treat every situation a little bit different based on, their experience or what they've gone through. So it's always going to be a little bit different. But I think the general rule of thumb to keep in mind is that generally how NCARB and especially the AIA contracts want you to practice really is, generally speaking, best practice for how you should run your practice. Will there be situations that are different or very, very specific? Yes, obviously. But again, just sticking with the whole point that the rule of thumb is that what we're trying to learn here is generally
Sure.
how you should understand these concepts.
Hmm.
So, I've seen contracts a bazillion different ways. I've seen processes a bazillion different ways. I've seen, especially with the exams that might test you over, detailing and documentation and drafting. I've seen things drawn multiple different ways. But generally speaking, the way that they're trying to test you is best practice.
Yeah.
And the real world is just taking best practice and modifying it for their specific needs.
Hmm. Yeah, I think actually that's a good point, and I think maybe as Michael had mentioned, this idea of hey, I'm going to go learn some stuff, which is going to be a little bit different than how I'm doing it in my practice. And if you have this sort of mindset of it's going to be pretty interesting. I'm glad that I get to go learn these things I haven't experienced before. I feel like you hear folks who have that experience, they tend to maybe do a little bit better on the tests because they're more open-minded about it. Versus, I know I've heard folks before who are like, well, that's not how you do it. This is how you do it, and they sort of they go into these exams, I think, sort of with this, maybe more sort of clouded perspective on what's going on in the test. Um, and I mean, to your point, the delivery models and the contracts that they use and the things that they reference, they're all, how do you say this? I think instructionally sound. In other words, and I'm probably not using the right language here, but I know that in fact they have a giant study that they did in order to where they surveyed many thousands of architects in order to figure out what the most prevalent and competent ways are to practice. In fact, I was just talking to Jared at the A’19 conference, and he was explaining to me how they're actually, they do that report every 5 to 10 years. He said they're just at the front end of starting the next one, and that they're basically responsible for, you know, ensuring that the test that they're testing us on is actually relevant to practice. And so they have to do this massive study, and they have to be able to prove that the test is actually relevant, which is really interesting because he was talking about how, practice is changing and how, um, delivery models are changing and so on and so forth, which I don't know. I never thought I would find those sorts of things interesting, but it actually is really interesting because things really are, things are changing in practice, and so they have to accommodate things accordingly.